next sort of mini seminar is on temporal phenotyping, and the person giving it is not someone you will see on this slide because they aren't actually one of our current lab members anymore. It's actually Changhee Lee, who's a recent graduate from our lab. He graduated just this year. He's a former PhD student, and now he's an assistant professor at Chung-An University in Seoul. So Changhee is in Korean time zone, and obviously delivering his presentation live would be too much of an ask. So he's actually pre-recorded, and I believe he is actually in this session as well, and available to answer questions. So do feel free to ask him your questions if you have any.
Hi everyone, this is Changhee Lee, a former PhD student from the Schaar lab. Now I'm an assistant professor in Chung-An University in Korea. I will be presenting temporal phenotyping, which aims at transforming complex time series observations into actionable information. We have been making real clinical impact on many different diseases. One representative example is our recent work published in Lancet Digital Health, which is a very high-impact journal. Here we focused on building a novel machine learning approach under automated machine learning framework to develop an improved prognostic model for predicting 10-year prostate cancer-specific mortality. More specifically, we focused on a cohort of approximately 170,000 men in the US who are diagnosed with non-metastatic prostate cancer. We provided significant improvement over traditional prostate cancer risk scores, and we also provided subgroup analysis that highlights the gain over the traditional rule-based risk scores. However, considering the disease progression only in the static setting can be limited. This is because disease progression manifests through a broad spectrum of clinical factors over time. And nowadays, more and more longitudinal observations are collected in electronic health records, which gives more opportunities for machine learning models. This is an example of longitudinal observations for a prostate cancer patient in active surveillance. This figure shows PSA observations over time. I want to highlight from this figure that the PSA measurements has irregular time intervals, even for a given patient. And different patients can have different number of observations. What makes it worse and more difficult for us to use longitudinal observation is that there are a set of observations from different modalities. And different modalities may have different time intervals and number of observations as well. And things get even worse if we include more observations from different modalities. So we want a personalized model of care based on these complex longitudinal observations. And we want to provide actionable information such that clinical researchers can use it and can understand it. To do so, we first want to accurately predict time to event outcomes and want these predictions dynamically updated with new observations. The second goal is to understand disease progression mechanisms by dividing high-dimensional and heterogeneous longitudinal observations into small subgroups. So one question can be outstanding. How should we group patients? And how should we group these time series observations? So under the conventional notion of clustering, people have been focused on providing distances between a pair of time series observations using either new distance metrics such as dynamic time warping or by using fixed size embeddings that can be used to compute Euclidean distances. However, such a conventional notion is often not able to capture the similarity of the time to event outcomes. And this is important because time to event outcomes are often the main focus of many prognostic models. To resolve such an issue, We introduce a new notion of clustering by defining the similarity of longitudinal observations with respect to the future time-to-event outcomes of our interest. And we call it outcome-oriented clustering. So this is an illustration that shows how different notions of clustering will result in discovering different subgroups. We formally define the problem of discovering the outcome-oriented temporal phenotypes as finding discrete representations that can best describe the time-to-event outcomes. And we introduce some novel techniques in order to overcome challenges associated with solving our objectives. Now, I will show the experimental results. First, this is the experimental setup where we have longitudinal observations of a patient up to a certain time point, and we make time-to-event predictions at that time point over multiple time horizons for evaluation. This slide shows the quantitative results. We compare our method with traditional methods, including well-known landmarking models. As can be seen in the two tables, our method outperforms the benchmarks most of the times in terms of both discrimination and calibration. The performance gain is especially larger and significant when more longitudinal observations are used for time-to-event predictions. Okay, this is the demonstrator that implements the personalized model of care for prostate cancer patients with longitudinal observations. This is currently a beta version, but we will make it public in the near future. Our demonstrator shows all the details of patient features, both static and longitudinal. It also shows the predicted time-to-event outcomes, which is the risk of having a CpG3 event or higher event as a function of time. This also visualizes a cluster space, which shows PCA projections of the latent representations based on what we learned using our deep learning method. We can confirm that different risk subgroups are well distinguished in this space. So let me give you an example of this patient. So we have demographic and static observations that were available by the time of diagnosis. And we also have longitudinal observations for this patient. So at the very beginning, the risk was quite low. And we can see that the trajectory of this patient was heading toward low-risk clusters. However, as more observations are collected over time, the risk was increasing, and we can find out that the patient was heading toward more high-risk clusters. At the time of about 20 observations, the risk was really high, and this patient was at the very high-risk cluster. So we were able to confirm that this patient actually had CpD3 plus event at the end of the observation. So using the demonstrator, we can provide more actionable information by visualizing the risk predictions, temporal phenotypes issued by the proposed method. And this is the end of my presentation. Thank you.